Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for getting out of bed on a Sunday morning. It's lovely to see you all here. I'm Karen Shannon, and I'm the Chief Exec of Manchester Histories. And we're delighted to be here today for our celebration day in collaboration with University Manchester at the University of Manchester, celebrating 200 years of the university. Let's give it a whoop. Great. We've got a fun-packed programme today, and obviously we've got Michael kicking it off for us for the day. But there's a lot I'm just going to share a bit of information before Michael comes on. So obviously we've got lots of activity here happening on the green and in Bloom. And we've also got a Histories and Heritage Marketplace happening in Manchester Central Library, just up the road. And also later on today, there is a wonderful carnival at the Whitworth Art Gallery. So there's a few things to see. So if you fancy it, you can either hop on a bus or walk up to the library or get on one of those bikes that can transport you up and down really quickly. There's also some talks as well at the library as well today. But there's lots of activity here. There are some brochures, so I would encourage you to have a look through. Also in the Student Union over the way, we've got some conversations that start at 1 o'clock. But I hope you have a fantastic day at Manchester Histories Festival 2024 in collaboration with the university. So, I have the pleasure of inviting one of our patrons as well at Manchester Histories. Michael, you've been with us for a few years now, haven't you? And we know each other very well. But for those that you don't know Michael, Michael Wood is an acclaimed historian, broadcaster, and he's also a professor of public history here at the University of Manchester. He's been in a lot of TV shows telling us about the histories and heritage of not just the UK, but on a global platform. Michael is going to talk to us today about the fascinating history of the University of Manchester. So I'm not going to go on. I'm just going to now invite Michael to the stage. And can we please give him a very big round of applause? Michael Wood, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. It's lovely to be here. I was really hoping for one of those fabulous blue sky days with crowds here, and instead rainy Manchester's kind of lived up to its name a bit. But thanks for braving the weather to come here. You know, we're celebrating the 200th anniversary of the university, but it's also Manchester Histories, and Karen quite fairly had the idea that we should have a talk that talked about the history of the university, set into the history of Manchester. And I confess right at the start, of course, that I'm not a 19th century historian, but nonetheless, it's a really great honour to be invited to speak about the history of the university on this very happy anniversary. And if I can add a personal note, especially because I come from Manchester, a long time, I mean, all my grandparents were Mancunians, and some of them went back a long way. My father's family are certainly recorded in Failsworth in the very beginning of the 18th century, for example. They moved in 1900-ish to Moston after the Second World War, to Moss Side, and then to Wythenshawe, which was the last, in the new brave new world of Wythenshawe, which was the last stop of our family history, if you like. And I should also add that my dad did pharmacy, trained as an external student in pharmacy here in the 1930s. So you can imagine that it's a really great pleasure to tell a few stories about the university's history, which are very near to my heart. 200 years. Anniversaries are thought-provoking affairs, aren't they, don't you think? Even at the level of birthdays, but let alone at bicentenaries. They make us look afresh at our changing relation to the world and to our past, thinking about who we are and where we've come from, and maybe too where we're heading. And in 200 years, the University of Manchester has grown out of all proportion to its small beginnings, and we're going to look at the small beginnings more closely in a minute, but its small beginnings as one of the early mechanics institutes. That's where it starts, to become one of the leading universities in the UK, the biggest conventional university in the UK, along with UCL. And we always like to say the most popular by volume of applications, not surprisingly. So it's fair to say, too, a world-renowned place in research, higher education, and so on. In that time, too, of course, and you can never lose sight of this, can you? Unbelievable changes in the world as a whole and the nation. We look back today, over 200 years of almost unbelievable social and political change in the nation, which the founders could never remotely have foreseen. We're on a cusp now, I think. You know, as a great university should, we must and we do look forward to the future full of optimism and a sense of opportunity, but also shadowed by fundamental questions of the deepest concern to everybody. The failure of our politics. I think it's fair to say our political system is no longer fit for purpose. The rise of the right. The growing, worrying, growing disparity between rich and poor, a gap which, as historians look at it, you can see narrowed between 1945 and 1980, but is now widening and widening. We face European war again. We never dreamed we would, which threatens to spread wider. And of course, above all, the stark existential threat of climate change. In times like this, the role of the university as a stronghold of progressive thinking, of humanistic ideals, critical judgment, technical invention and innovation, and dare one not say also as an upholder of civic values in an open democratic society will be even more crucial in a world where, with AI and everything else, the traditional foundations of learning are changing like no other time in history. Okay. 1824. How did it begin? This magnificent campus. I was walking through from the station the other day on a sunlit evening. It's huge, isn't it? With a student body of over 40,000 from all over the world. And being a historian, I hope you'll forgive me if I reach back first before 1824 to set the scene. Reading the early accounts of Manchester, you'd be very hard pushed to see our future in their past. When John Leyland, Henry VIII's antiquarian, rode into Manchester in the 1540s, it was, he said, and I suppose I should give him a Lancashire accent because John Leyland, as you can tell from his name, was a Lancastrian. It was the fairest, best builded, quickest, and most populous town of Lancashire, he said, with fine red stone, sandstone houses and bridges, and a fair marketplace, he said. But by any scale, it was tiny. We don't know. 4,000 people, maybe, something like that. It was still small in the 18th century, maybe 10,000 people, when Daniel Defoe memorably in the 1720s called it the greatest mere village in England. Mere village, eh? The town still had less than 20,000 people in the late 18th century when Georgian families picnicked in the grassy meadows by the banks of the River Irwell. But by the mid-19th century, one lifetime later, it was described memorably by Friedrich Engels as a kind of industrial hell on earth. A phenomenon that drew observers from all over Europe and America just to observe what they saw as a vision of the future. In a few fiery decades, the city had expanded like a kind of supernova, its population increasing 25 times in that small space of time to become a new thing in history. As they said on the publicity for Manchester about 20 years ago, the original modern. There are many stories about that period in Manchester legend. Marx and Engels meeting in the little alcove room in Chetham's library to churn over the great patterns of history. Engels and Mary Burns, his longtime companion, his Irish lover, going through Little Ireland and Angel Meadow. She's a kind of Virgil to his Dante, if you like. She who sold pamphlets and oranges in socialist meetings on Saturday mornings in Deansgate. Of course, Engels' father was a factory owner. Engels, for all his great heart and his socialist credentials, rode with the Cheshire Hunt. Liked a fine bottle of French wine. And of course, all the other great travellers and novelists and journalists, people who wrote books about it, Mrs. Gaskell, Dickens, Alexis de Tocqueville, the greatest of all commentators on England in this period, who describes meeting a Manchester factory owner on a muddy street somewhere near Castlegate and pointing out the poverty all around and receiving a blunt reply, "Ah, yes, sir, but a great deal of money is to be made here," and then turning on his heels and peremptorily dismissing de Tocqueville, "I bid you good day, sir," and off he went. Now, the city that Engels was writing about, precisely in those years, Manchester was actually changing dramatically in many, many different ways by movements from the bottom, the founding of new institutions and stuff like that, in a very dynamic way. And the young Disraeli accurately saw that when he described it, when he said this, "Properly considered, Manchester is as great an exploit as ancient Athens." Here was the world's first industrial society based on factories, which would change the whole world, from Lancashire to today's Asian megacities like Shenzhen. So that's my first big point this morning. You know, a swift sketch, but that kind of background is out of which our university rose as the first civic university in England. To be fair to Scotland, of course, Strathclyde, Anderson's University, founded in 1828, did have its beginnings earlier as an educational institute. But our university's origin, I'd just like to stress, is directly and uniquely embedded in and connected with great events in history, the sense of being at the centre of things. And that's always been part of the university's outlook. Before we move on to what actually happened in 1824, I should say something too about the idea of the university itself, especially as we were the first English civic university. The founding of Manchester University 200 years ago came at a point when a different idea of what a university could be had arisen for the first time in history. The impulse was essentially, I suppose you would say, practical and democratic. The old medieval universities across Europe, Bologna, Paris, Oxford, in them, higher education was developed to support power. The universities trained scholars, scribes, and theologians, first and foremost, to sustain the ideologies of the state and, of course, its religion. The modern idea of the university arose in the Industrial Revolution in England and in Western Europe, especially in Germany at that time, very important, as the hold of the ruling class began to loosen on our educational, religious, and cultural life. The roots of that, it's probably worth me saying, and as a historian I can't resist, because there are always causes behind causes, aren't there? The roots lie in the dramatic expansion of education in the Tudor age, with the revolution in grammar schools, the growth in literacy in the period of the Civil War, and the explosion in nonconformity after the Civil War and in the 18th century. Nonconformity would be a really, really big influence on education in England, and especially here in Manchester. The religious nonconformists, who'd been at the heart of 17th century radicalism, were barred from going to the great universities of Oxford and Cambridge. But across Britain, in many private academies through the 18th century, curricula of amazing width were taught, with mechanics and algebra, physics, anatomy, even modern history, which was unthinkable in Oxford. They were also offered education to women. Some of the great figures in late 18th century, early 19th century, progressive intellectual life were women and the product of nonconformist academies. One great example, for example, was the educator, poet, pamphleteer and writer Anna Letitia Barbeau, who clashed with Wordsworth and Coleridge over her anti-war views in the Napoleonic War. So those were a few of the strands that go into the founding of the university. The time and the place were no accident, as things mostly never are in history, neither in the big picture, the long term, the longue durée, as they say, nor in the close-up. So now we come to the immediate background of 1824. In the early 19th century, coming out of the Napoleonic Wars, Manchester was a cauldron of industry, but also terrible deprivation, of radical ideas and social movements. And they included women's movements, by the way. Almost all the major towns in Lancashire had women's suffrage groups by 1819. So there were huge social and economic pressures in the period after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And here in Manchester in 1819, the government brought in cavalry to violently suppress a huge demonstration. A demonstration for political reform. It took place in St. Peter's Fields, near Central Library. The place is marked today by a monument put up 6 years ago on the anniversary. On an eye-popping blue sky day in August, when 60,000 people gathered, the women all in their Sunday best, it was a Wakes Week atmosphere, said the radical Sam Bamford. All the villages around Manchester contributed marches, and processions stopped in each to gather supporters. My father's village of Failsworth, which had erected a Liberty flagpole at the time of the French Revolution, and had a radical library with Tom Paine's Rights of Man available for borrowing. Can you believe it? There, the march leaders were crowned with caps of liberty on their march into Manchester when they stopped there on that far-off sunny day for a drink. In the event, when they reached Manchester, the demonstration was attacked by cavalry and yeomanry. 17 people were killed and 600 or 700 injured, many of them badly hurt with sabres or trampled by horses. The women especially seem to have been targeted. A peaceful demonstration was suppressed like a violent insurrection. The newspapers covered the so-called Peterloo massacre in harrowing detail. Even establishment papers, some people feel that this was the Times' greatest hour, surprisingly. The Manchester Guardian was founded in the immediate aftermath. Afterwards, broadsheets and pamphleteers pressed for wider suffrage, and great poets of the day like Shelley and Byron turned their art to social justice. Most famous, of course, is Shelley's Mask of Anarchy. I saw murder on the way. He had a face like Castlereagh, he said, the politician who had most set himself against reform. And Shelley's famous cry, "You are many and they are few," would resonate right the way down to today, although it should be said that censorship actually stopped Shelley's poem being published in his own lifetime. The massacre had a huge impact on politics at all levels of society. Change was in the air. The people were demanding representation and wider education, and the rights of the ordinary people of Britain had become an issue. Manchester University then began in the immediate aftermath of those events as a mechanics institute. If you look for a metaphor or an analogy, just thinking about these events and the coalescence of all these institutions that become our university, I find myself thinking like looking at the growth of a great tree, that the university today is a great tree, spreading out. But going back over its growth over the 200 years, you see this network of roots pushing deep into the soil of Manchester and, of course, upwards from it. Our founding moment was the 7th of April, 1824, at the Bridgewater Arms Hotel, sadly no longer there. First of all, as the Manchester Mechanics Institute. Only later did we become the Institute of Science and Technology, later UMIST. Among our founders, the chemist and pioneer of atomic theory, John Dalton, whose pensive statue you can see just inside the foyer of Manchester Town Hall. And for anybody who's interested in Manchester history, I absolutely recommend you to go to Manchester Town Hall and walk around. Just see what they were trying to do in the 19th century. With him, a group of Manchester industrialists and businessmen who believed that workers' education, especially in science, was crucial to the future fortunes of the nation. And these mechanics institutes were a new phenomenon in the 1820s, Edinburgh in 1821, Liverpool in 23, and they spread like wildfire. And today, if you travel around South Lancashire, there's hardly a reasonably sized town in South Lancashire. You know, Oldham, Bury, Rochdale. You just go around and you'll see these magnificent Victorian Mechanics Institutes, which they proudly still stand in those cities. The aim was to provide adult education, especially in technical subjects, to working men, still just men, but often with libraries and other facilities that were used by women. At a time, remember, when universal primary school education was still not provided for by the state. That wouldn't come fully until 1880. So this is before the era of when education was accessible to all. Now, we're going to look at our founding document. It's always intriguing, isn't it, to go back to the basic principles. The Manchester Mechanics Institution, to give it its full title, was formed, and I quote, "for the purpose of enabling mechanics and artisans to become acquainted with such branches of science as are of practical application in the exercise of their trade, so that they may possess a more thorough knowledge of their business and acquire a greater degree of skill in the practice of it, and be qualified to make improvements and even new inventions in the arts which they respectively possess. There is no art which does not depend more or less on scientific principles. And to teach what these are and to point out their practical application is the chief object of this institution." That original purpose of the Manchester Mechanics Institute was never forgotten, but increasingly the stress began to be placed on the personal benefits to be derived from the Institute and its wider social functions. In other words, not only applied technical and scientific education, but a broader goal of training and making better citizens, let's put it that way. From around 1830, the scope of education in the institution was widened to include more elementary aspects. There were proposals to set up reading groups in the surrounding areas that would be supplied with books from the Institute's library, and also moves to encourage involvement in sport and in general social events. So it starts even then in the 1830s to adopt a kind of holistic attitude to higher education. The goal is to improve, enable, and liberate the whole person. Changes then included the creation of a room for reading newspapers. Many of the older generation will still remember those rooms. You could go in and the daily newspaper, mounted on a long stick, is there on a lectern for you to turn over and to read. Still there when I was a kid in some of these places. There was a change in the kind of lectures which became less rigidly based on purely scientific topics, as also did the stock of the libraries. And events such as concerts, exhibitions, excursions played a more important role, and there were facilities for educating women and children. There's one other aspect of the early Mechanics Institute that I have to mention to you. It will amuse you, I think. This, as a historian, I love this. In the early days, there were requests to begin classes in history. But these were rejected because of fears that they would lead to debates about politics. It was ever thus, you say, the past is dangerous, isn't it? The past is dangerous. And studying history could lead to you trying to rewrite what's in the history books. To quote a recent minister of our present government, rewriting history books, my goodness, what will happen next? As if that wasn't the actual job of a historian. The actual job is to rewrite history. Although, in fairness to the university, I should add, of course, that Manchester University would have a very, very distinguished roster of historians in later times. Namier, Thomas Tout, Powick, A.J.P. Taylor, the first TV historian, if you like. And some of these people were path-breaking in their application to public history. George Unwin, for example, Professor George Unwin, in 1895 set up workers' education classes and the university settlement, as he called it, to bring art and culture to the poor people of Manchester. They went out to the community. So that's the start. One other thing I should mention, and of course, I remember a friend of mine saying when I said, I'm going to talk about the history of the university, and he said, that's going to be a bit like watching wallpaper dry, isn't it? And actually, it's so full of amazing stories that we don't even have time to tell them all today. But one I must mention is the international aspect of this early period. Manchester is a city of immigrants. There's hardly anybody in the city whose ancestor didn't come from somewhere else. It's in the very nature of the place. The population's from all over the British Isles, but it's always had great connections with Europe. Many of the university's founders, the early Mechanics Institute and so on, had an education, higher education in Germany. Germany's even left its mark in our street names. Brunswick Street, just outside. Really big mark. Think of the people. Engels, of course. Charles Halley, the founder of the Halley Orchestra. The great philanthropists, the Simons. Hans Geiger. Carl Schorlemmer, who was Britain's first chair in organic chemistry. And among the early backers of the Mechanics Institute was Charles Bayer. German-born railway engineer, philanthropist, his pictures just there in the quad, who helped found an engineering chair and endowed a professorship in applied mathematics. He bequeathed 10 million in his will in those days. He funded the entire cost of the Bayer building to house biology and geology departments. By any standards, these were really remarkable people. Some of you will remember the Bayer Peacock locomotive construction works out in Gorton, near my dad's shop, whose products, of course, went out across the whole world and are still functioning in some places. So from the start, Manchester was internationalist in outlook, as it still is today. So there you've got a picture of the beginnings. Down-to-earth, practical, realistic, aspirational world of the Northern Mechanics Institute in a time of huge social change. But there's another big strand to the story. Our story is one where many different strands, as I've suggested, come together. The university is actually a combination of several different institutions, which only finally united in 2004. And that's one reason, one thing I think that makes it so special. Now, I've no time to tell you the whole story, of course, but the same year of 1824, the Royal School of Medicine and Surgery was founded in the city. It's another case of the roots of the university that at some point will grow into that great tree. And in medicine, too, it was to do with changing the huge imbalance between London and the regions. on one simple level, to increase the number of doctors practicing outside the capital at a time when the population was shooting up. Conditions of ordinary people were poor, and medicine was an urgent need. And I should mention two of the heroes of this tale. First of all, Joseph Jordan, who founded the first Manchester School of Anatomy. He was a Mancunian, born in 1787, incredible to think, apprenticed at the age of 15 to a surgeon at the public infirmary of Manchester. And in 1814, he started doing lectures in anatomy from a building in Bridge Street. It was a challenge to the London medical establishment. And what Jordan hoped was it would help students who otherwise would have to do the very costly business of going to London if they wanted to obtain a diploma from the Royal College of Surgeons. And he also hoped to raise the number of doctors practicing outside the capital. It took off. In 1817, his school became the first provincial institution to be recognised by the Society of Apothecaries as a teaching establishment. And in 1821, when it was recognised by the Royal College of Surgeons, it became the Royal School of Medicine. I'm sure Jordan wouldn't like me to mention, but he did occasionally run into trouble, not just with public opinion, but even with the law on one occasion, due to his alleged use of body snatchers. And even the direct involvement of himself and his students in the surreptitious procurement of suitable corpses for study. Typical Mancunian enterprise, if you ask me. But Jordan's School of Anatomy would join up with another pioneering medical institution in the city, and that was Thomas Turner's Medical School. He'd been a house surgeon at Manchester Infirmary till he retired in 1820, and after that became elected to a member of another great Manchester institution, the Manchester Literary and Philosophical Society, which turned out to be a kind of code switcher. It's still in its wonderful buildings in Mosley Street and still going strong, because it was in the Lit and Phil that Turner met John Dalton, the pioneer of nuclear theory, along with a great supporter of the Institute. And he became a big supporter of medical innovation in the city. And to cut a long story short, the Lit and Phil hosted a series of lectures on the anatomy and physiology and pathology of the human body. And then in 1824, they announced the plans for a school of medicine and surgery in Manchester, the first major provincial school of medicine in England. We don't, you'll be pleased to know, have to follow all the ins and outs of this, but you get the picture. This was a period when public-minded people from many walks of life combined to create new institutions for what we might almost call a new city, to create an alternative narrative also to the one that was going around with the journalists and the novelists and all the rest about Manchester as a kind of hellhole. So it was out of these beginnings, the Mechanics' Institute, Jordan and Turner's colleges of anatomy and medicine, the input of local learned societies like the Lit and Phil, which all drove forward to lift the city and its people. And finally, there's a third strand before we kind of sum up this story of civic innovation and cooperation. And that's Owens College. Now, most of you will know that name. It's a big Manchester name, Owens College. It had been founded in 1851 to give a further education on non-sectarian grounds. It was named after John Owen, who was a textile merchant who left £100,000 in his will, a lot of money then, maybe £15 million today, but much more than that in purchasing power. By the end of the 50s, Owens College was approved as a provincial examination centre for matriculation candidates of the University of London. But it had no medical teaching facilities, and it made sense to amalgamate with the Royal Medical School, the biggest in Britain outside London. Turner had tried earlier to persuade them to include medicine at Owens College, but the trustees had refused because they feared medical students were so rowdy that they might lower the tone of the college. Well, we all know that, don't we? We've all seen that before, haven't we? But in 1872, they combined as a medical faculty. So now you can see how it all starts to come together. The Mechanics Institute, the institution, the medical colleges, Owens College. And as things progressed, the premises of the college became inadequate. And that's when Alfred Waterhouse comes in. Can we see his building from here? The architect of the London Natural History Museum. He was invited to be the architect of a new college building west of Oxford Road, which was opened in 1873. It's still one of the masterpieces of high Victorian art. And it's in some sense, 150 years ago to us. But it's a wonderful connection, that building, with this deeper past, and in a sense defined us. Still, by that time, in the later 19th century, the red brick civic university movement was in full swing. And Owens College became the Victoria University by Royal Charter in 1880, our first civic university. And the newly amalgamated Victoria University of Manchester was established by Royal Charter in July 1903 and merged with Owens College in 1904. The university and UMIST, though, carried on through the 20th century in parallel lines. Let me just check. And it seems to me, looking at those two now big institutions, the university and the Institute of Technology, you might say they represent what C.P. Snow called the two cultures, the faces of education, science and the humanities. And they closely cooperated through the 20th century. And finally, again, cutting a long story short, on the 5th of March 2003, it was announced that the university was to merge with UMIST to form the largest campus-based university in the UK, the University of Manchester. It was inaugurated in October 2004 with nearly 20,000 full-time students, including 2,500 international students from more than 120 countries, and was immediately recognised as one of the top universities in the country, frequently achieving top ratings for its research. And of course, it's doubled in size since, more than 40,000 now. And today, the university excels in both those great areas of intellectual, academic life, the sciences and the humanities. Shown recently, for example, with the isolation of graphene, which won our scientists a Nobel Prize in 2010, I think. Okay, that's the story. You must forgive the swift shortcutting. The story I've briefly told you in the last half hour has several very special features, and one of them I've already alluded to today. It's the fact that today's university, consolidated only in 2004, was the product of this almost organic growth of several different institutions, which almost like living organisms have come together, cooperated, and then amalgamated over time to become bigger and bigger and better and better, and yet to have retained elements of their ancient identity. The Mechanics Institute, the two medical schools, Owens College, the Institute of Science and Technology, UMIST, even later the Whitworth, which is now part of the university, the John Rylands Library, which is now part of the university, and not forgetting Jodrell Bank Observatory. Even the venerable Manchester Lytton Phil, which will celebrate its 250th anniversary pretty soon, has played its part too, reaching out across the life of the city, but also the life of the city coming in to grow the university, if you like, in an almost symbiotic way. And this seems to me to give the university a special strength in the way it works with the city. Building up, as we historians say, the group feeling, essential for any democratic society to really flourish. And and to cope with the ups and downs inevitable in social life in any state, but especially in the troubled times of our own. Back in 1824, the founders, Dalton, Bayer, Jordan, Turner, Owens, were far-sighted people who believed that there is such a thing as society, that we have a right to a good education, all of us, whatever path we take in life, and that educated citizens make the best state, because democracy depends not merely on the consent of the governed, but the informed consent of the governed. And that's all the more true now amid the daily torrent of fake news and false truths on social media, and now the staggering threat of AI-generated falsehoods. A critical mind, surely, is one of our greatest resources. And universities, above all, teach us to develop critical minds. And they teach us, too, the most important lessons about social solidarity and civic virtue. They tell us that there is such a thing as society, and that we all have duties and obligations to our fellow citizens, and we can all play a role, however small, to make it better. That's what universities do. So, here's to a great Manchester anniversary, with the spirits looking down. The founders, like John Dalton, Rutherford, the great alumni, Niels Bohr, Wittgenstein, Alan Turing, Norman Foster, Peter Maxwell Davies, Anthony Burgess, James Lovelock, and the great women alumni, the engineer Tilly Schilling, Catherine Chisholm, the first woman graduate in medicine, Christabel Pankhurst, the suffragette, Ellen Wilkinson, who was the first female Minister of Education and who famously led the Jarrow March in 1936. And today we could reel them off, all the great alumni of whom we're so proud. Steve Ferber, John Sulston, Jeanette Winterson, Brian Cox, pictures all over Oxford Road. Respect, Brian. Meera Syal, Sophie Rayworth, Samia Hussain, Safraz Mansour, not forgetting the new manager of Bayern Munich, Vincent Kompany. Respect, Vincent. And of course, today's generation of students and recent alumni who are already making their mark on society. And as we approach the next 100 years, the university as an institution is now an essential part of the life of our city. Not just a huge student body, not just a huge employer, but its ethos affecting the whole ethos of the city. I remember the mayor, Andy Burnham, viewing a little film on the history department that we'd produced during COVID. And he said to Nancy Rothwell, "Oh, it makes me want to come and study history in the university." You know, everything connects. Our world, to be sure, at this moment faces difficult times. And to save us, if I can put it so dramatically, we need science and the humanities to come together with innovative, cutting-edge technologies, but driven by truly humanistic ideals. And walking around in the sunshine, it was the last few days, walking around the last 4 days in the sunshine, listening to concerts and seminars and seeing exhibitions and seeing the crowds of young students from all over the world talking and celebrating, made me feel there can be a few better places than here to do that. So let's look forward to a rich, diverse, and ever innovative future in research, in learning, and in teaching. And also in that goal of social responsibility that we can trace back over those 200 years to the original public-spirited founders in 1824, who were above all saw themselves as working for the public good.
What time is it now? So I don't think we've got many time for questions, unfortunately. Can we just have a time check?
Just before 1:45, yeah.
All right, we have to stop, I'm afraid, Michael. But Michael will be... Let me just get on here. Michael will be back. So please do come back at 2 o'clock, where Michael will be playing famously with some other great musicians called Manchester Ballads. So it's music meets history. So please do come back at 2, but actually having a little break now, and then we've got the Bright Club. So do please stay for a bit of comedy. And as I said, there's a full programme. Please stay with us. There's food and drink all over the place. So have a little drink and then come back. Next, we've got Bright Club, and we've got our hosts, Black Liver, who are going to take us through the day. Did you want to say anything?
Yeah,
else,
just if you are interested at the 2 o'clock, we're actually, the gig that we're doing, which is about an hour, is actually singing songs which mainly come from the Manchester Ballads collection of published ballads from the 19th century about the story of Manchester, going from Peterloo through to the suffragettes and stuff like that. And some of them are really good fun. Yeah.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it.
We haven't rehearsed yet. That's where I've got to
It's
go
going to be
next.
improvised. So yeah, enjoy your day, everybody, and thank you for joining us. And hopefully the weather will pick up. Thank you. Thanks, Mark.